Hey guys, I'm Val. So the purpose of this build is to take advantage of Helltides being the best place to level. And to do this, we're going to be using Pulverize, which is one of the earliest AoE abilities for Druids. We're going to make the ability spammable and do as much damage as possible. This build requires no uniques, and it will take you from the early game all the way until the end game. For the abilities, I am using Trample. This will be used for a form of movement, Unstoppable, and it will also give us Spirit back when used. The next ability is Earthen Bulwark. We're going to be using this as another form of Unstoppable and Barrier. And for the third ability, we are going to be using Debilitating Roar. We're just going to put 1 point into this. It's a really good defensive ability. For the ultimate, I'm using Grizzly Rage. It's our third form of Unstoppable. You gain 20% damage and damage reduction, and your damage is increased by 3% each second while in this form. You also heal for 8% of your maximum life per second. For the basic, I'm using Earth Spike. This is just so we have a ranged ability to generate spirit when needed. A better option for the early levels would be Enhanced Wind Shear. This will apply vulnerability. Once you get to your first glyph of exploit, it really doesn't affect the gameplay too much because we're going to be using Pulverize most of the time. And for our main ability, we're using Pulverize. You slam the ground, dealing up to 18,000 damage to surrounding enemies. Your next Pulverize will overpower every 12 seconds while you remain healthy. Enemies hit with Pulverize deal 20% reduced damage for 4 seconds. We're going to modify this with our aspects to make the AoE larger and to make it spammable. It's also going to apply a slow debuff, which will increase our damage, and we will do more damage based on the fortify that we have. For the spirit boons, I'm using wariness. You take 15% reduced damage from elites. I'm also using swooping attacks for the 10% increased attack speed. For the next boon, we're using avian wrath. You gain 30% increased critical strike damage. I'm using calamity. You extend the duration of your ultimate skills by 25%. And masochistic. Critical strikes with shapeshifting skills have up to a 75% chance to heal you for 5% maximum life. Other good options would be Obsidian Slam to increase your damage, more guaranteed overpowers, Bolster to keep you fortified. I did forget to mention the boon Energize. Dealing damage has up to a 15% chance to restore 10 spirit. This can be useful for the build, especially in the very early game, but it's not going to be necessary. And Scythe Talons to increase your critical strike chance by 5%. For the aspects, we are going to be using Disobedience for the helm, which gives you armor and increases your survivability for leveling. For the chest, I'm using Quicksand, which is a crucial aspect for the build. Damage from Earth skills slow enemies hit by up to 44%. This applies crowd control, so we do more damage to them. For the gloves, Earth Sign Horror. Pulverize is now also an Earth skill. After casting Pulverize, Tectonic Spikes continue to deal damage over time. This works in combination with the previous aspect. For the pants, I'm using Exploiters. This is mainly to help with single target damage, because while they are unstoppable, we will deal increased damage up to 40%. For the boots, I'm using Ballistic. When you have Fortify, your skills gain +2 ranks. For the weapon, it's important to use a two-hander, and the aspect is going to be Shockwave. Pulverize creates a shockwave that travels forward, dealing up to 200% of its damage to targets in the path. Also, this is where the important tempering manals come into effect. We're going to increase the size of Pulverize up to 40%. On the amulet, I'm using Retaliation. Your core skills deal up to 45% increased damage based on your amount of Fortify. For the temper manual on the amulet, I would use either damage or critical strike chance. For the first ring, I'm using the aspect Umbral. This restores up to 6% of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy, which is another reason why we use the quicksand aspect on the chest. I'm using resource cost reduction for the temper manual. And for the second ring, I'm using Voracious Rage. Killing an enemy with a core skill refunds up to 30% of its base cost. Can only happen once per skill cast. Right here, I'm using up to a 5% chance to restore 10% primary resource. You could use this or resource cost reduction. There are uniques that will add to this build, such as Banished Lord's Talisman, and the Earth uniques, Vasili's Prayer, and Insatiable Fury. They are not required for leveling. For the skill tree, the basic skill, I have 1 point Earth Spike and Enhanced Earth Spike. The better choice for early game would be Wind Shear, because it has a chance to apply the debuff Vulnerable for 4 seconds. At this point in the build, these are more of just spirit generators, but for the most part, you should be one-shotting everything besides bosses. For the core skills, you're going to be putting 5 points into Pulverize, 1 point into Enhanced, and Primal Pulverize. Enemies hit with Pulverize deal 20% reduced damage. You could also use Raging Pulverize. Enemies overpowered by Pulverize are stunned for 3 seconds. I prefer Primal Pulverize just because it affects everything that you hit and it's better for leveling. 1 point into Heart of the Wild, 3 points into Wild Impulses. Your core skills cost 9% more spirit, but deal 15% increased damage. 3 points into Predatory Instinct, and 3 points into Iron Fur. For the defensive skills, I have 1 point into Earthen Bulwark, 1 point Enhanced Earthen Bulwark, 3 points into Ancestral Fortitude, 1 point into Vigilance, and 1 point into Debilitating Roar. For the companion skills, I have 3 points in Nature's Reach. You deal 9% increased damage to distant enemies. Double this bonus if they are also slowed, stunned, immobilized, or knocked back, which we apply slow with all our attacks. For the Wrath skills, 1 point into Mending, and 3 points into Provocation. 1 point into Trample, Enhanced, and Savage Trample. Casting Trample grants you 40 spirit. 3 points into Crushing Earth, 3 points into Stone Guard, and 1 point to Safeguard. For the ultimate skills, 3 points into Defiance, 3 points into Natural Disaster, 2 points into Resonance, and 3 points into Circle of Life. And for the ultimate, I'm using Grizzly Rage, Prime Grizzly Rage, and Supreme Grizzly Rage. You can choose Petrify or Cataclysm if you want to, because we're not heavily investing into Grizzly Rage. And for the key passive, I'm using Earthsign Strength. You gain 20% additional maximum life while in werebear form, and for 3 seconds after leaving werebear form. While healthy, you deal 30% increased damage and 30% increased overpower damage. This gives you a bonus to your defenses and your damage potential at all times. If you're still having trouble with spirit generation, I would use Earthen Might to make up for it. But eventually you should be able to focus more on damage than spirit generation. Now I'm going to show some gameplay from World Tier 1 to 4 using the same build, just leveling, just to give you an idea of how the build works. For the Paragon board, we're going to go up to the right. We're going to take the rare node Prime, increase your damage by 20% and 4% maximum life. The first glyph is going to be Exploit. This is very important while leveling. This is how we're going to apply Vulnerable. Next, we're going to go up and to the left. We're going to get Impel for 20% more damage. And later on, you will be picking up Resolve for the 6% to all resistance. That's not needed until World Tier 4. It's important that the next board is the Ancestral Guidance board. It's going to help with our spirit generation while leveling, and it increases our damage as well. We are going to take the legendary node. After spending 75 spirit, you deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. We're going to pick up all these spirit nodes as well. Spirit on kill and maximum spirit. Next, we're going to increase our core skill damage. And the glyph that we're going to be using here is Undaunted. It's just going to increase our damage slightly and give us damage reduction. If you don't have any glyphs leveled up to 15, this is one of the few that works here. You will be getting extra core damage here and resistances. And then we're going to go up, and our next Paragon board is going to be Earthen Devastation. Your skills deal 10% increased critical strike damage, increased by up to 20% of your damage versus crowd control bonus, up to 40%. And you're going to grab Impress and the magic nodes next to it to increase the damage to crowd control to boost the bonus of Earthen Devastation. You're going to get more resist here and Earth critical strike damage. The glyph we are going to be using here is Earth and Sky. Nature magic skills deal 10% increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Then we're going to go back down to that Ancestral Guidance board and go out the right. The next board is going to be Survival Instincts. While in werebear form, you deal 1% increased damage up to 50% for every 1% difference in current life percent between you and the enemy. This is going to help you deal more damage to bosses. I will have a finished version of the leveling Paragon board, and then changes made once you do level your glyphs in the links below. For the build review, Pulverize has always been a really strong leveling build. I've used it since season 1. I enjoy it. It's easy to use. You don't need any uniques, and it does take you all the way to the end game. Personally, if you were lucky enough to get Dolmen Stone early on, I would switch to my other build, Endless Boulder Storm, or just start playing a Boulder Storm build in general, because it will be stronger. I will say this build is getting improved with Season 4. I don't see it being an endgame build for this season. I think the only time it was viable for super endgame content was Season 2. There's too many aspects required. There's not a lot of room for uniques or to improve the build. It will get you to endgame, but at that point, that's where other builds are going to shine. Thank you for all the support. Appreciate you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.